So with this quick look at onGenerate route and onUnknown route, which can be useful depending on which app you're building, let's go back to this app we're building here. Let's make sure that for a selected meal, we show more details. This, of course, again, has no direct connection to navigation, but practicing to combine widgets with each other and build nice user interfaces certainly also isn't too bad, I guess. So let's go to the meal detail screen and now work on that. In there, instead of the centered widget, I want to have a column because we'll have a couple of pieces of information or a couple of different elements on top of each other. At the very top, for example, I want to display the image of the recipe. Then I also want to show the ingredients and then the steps it takes to, build this or to make this dish. Hence, at the very top, I'll first of all add a container which should hold the image, where I'll give this a height of 300 and a width of double infinity to be as broad as possible to basically span the full width of the device screen. And the child of that container will be the image. So here we can use image.network. And now we need to find out which meal the user selected. Keep in mind that we do extract the meal ID here. We can, of course, now use the meal ID to find the full meal here in our dummy data source. So in the meal detail screen, we can now import from that dummy data Dart file so that we have access to the dummy meals. And now we can get the selected meal here by having a look at all our meals, all our dummy meals stored in this dummy meals constant. And before we used where to filter a couple of fitting elements, now we want to have only one fitting element, and for that we can use first where. This gives us one meal for which the condition in this function returns true. So again, this runs on every meal in the list, and when this function, this anonymous function returns true, it stops looking for more and gives us that item, that meal. And of course, the condition I want to check here with this shortcut syntax where I use the arrow function, where I don't need curly braces here, and the value of my expression here is immediately returned, I will compare meal ID to my meal ID up here. So meal.id, the ID for the meal we're looking at in dummy meals, compared to meal ID, this variable name here, which is the meal ID we got from our route arguments. Again, as I mentioned, this expression here, the value of that, so true or false, is immediately returned thanks to this shortcut here with the arrow function, and therefore we return true if the IDs match, and then we found our meal. So selected meal is the meal which the user picked, and therefore for the image down there, we can use selected meal image URL down there. Now on the image, I'll also set a fit to again fit it nicely into the surrounding container with box fit cover. Of course, you can also play around with different values here to see how the image is sized and cropped and squeezed differently based on the setting you choose here. With that, if you save it, you should see the image here already. Now, by the way, since we now have the selected meal, we can also show the title of the recipe here in the app bar. So instead of saying meal ID like this, let's add curly braces and use selected meal.title. The curly braces are required because we don't just refer to a single variable, but we have a little bit more complex expression. We use a dot notation here, and that only works with curly braces around it after the $sign. So now we're outputting the title and the image of the meal. Of course, that's by no means all. Besides the title and the image, I also want to show the ingredients of a meal. So after this container with the image, I'll add another container, and that container should hold some text where I simply say ingredients, basically as a caption for this, or as a title for the next list, which is a list of the available ingredients. Now that text should have a certain style, and that's a style we can probably set up globally in our theme. If we have a look at the theme, we have a title style already, and actually that is the style I want to use. So we can use that theme title style by referring to the theme here with off context, and then text theme title, just like that. This will style this text nicely. If we save this, we see ingredients here. Now it would be nice to have some margin between the image and the text. So therefore here on the container, I'll add margin and set this to edge insets symmetric and only target the vertical margin, so top and bottom, and set this to 10 maybe. Now we have some spacing between the title and the image, and this looks better in my opinion. Below that container, which really is just there so that we have a text, just a title for the upcoming list. So below that container here, I want to have a list of the various steps you have to execute. Now if I would add a list view like this here, we would run into a problem because adding a list view, which by default has an infinite height, in a column, which also tries to get as much height as possible, would throw an error. So instead we have to use a container here, which has a fixed height, and then add a list view as a child of that container. The fixed height here is of course totally up to you. I'll use a height of, let's say, 200 here. And maybe also only a width of 300 here. And you could use a media query to adjust this to different device sizes. I'll not do it here, also to save some time, because that's not the main focus of this app. But of course you can refine these values by using a media query as you learned it in the responsive and adaptive apps module in this course. Here I'll just use 300, and if that doesn't really work on small, very small devices, it's okay for me here. Obviously you can fine tune it with media query. So we have a height and a width. Let's now add the list view as the child here. And that list view can be created with a builder or with this constructor and children. Ultimately, it's totally up to you. Theoretically, we don't know how many ingredients we have, and it could be very many. So I will use builder, which gives us better performance for very long lists. Here for builder, as you learned it, you need the item count. And the item count, of course, is selected meal, ingredients, length, because we want to output all the ingredients here. Besides the item count, we also need the item builder, of course, and that gets the context created dynamically here for every list item, and then also the index of that list item. And we should return a widget here. And that widget, for me, will be a card, which I'll give a background color of our accent color, and that's just the style I want to use. As always, you can fine-tune this to your requirements and play around with the different values. And the child in the card will be a text, let's say, and that text, of course, should, for the ingredient with that index, output the name of that ingredient. And since ingredients for us is just a list of strings, the ingredient for a specific index is already the name of that ingredient. Let's save that. And this doesn't look too bad. Looks nice, but the problem I have with that is that if this would be smaller, let's say it has a height of 100, it would be not that obvious that you can scroll it, right? So the overall box here, the container which holds the list view, should probably have some decoration that clearly shows its boundaries and makes it more likely for the user to guess that you can scroll. So there, I'll add a box decoration and give this a color of white, so a white background color, and a border with border.all in all directions, which should be gray with colors gray. So this adds a border around the container with the border argument in the box decoration object we pass to the decoration argument of the container. And maybe also give that box rounded corners with border radius, and then border radius dot circular 10. Now let's also add some margin here with edge insets all of 10 around the entire container, and also some padding of edge insets all of 10. Whoops, that should be insets. And now every item here, so every card in the list view builder, also should have a little bit of padding inside of it, I'd say. So let's wrap the text, which is the content of the card, in another widget. And here we can just use the padding widget because I only want to add some padding. The padding here can be edge insets symmetric, to have different padding for left and right and top and bottom of, let's say, vertical 5 and horizontal 10. And now we have some padding around the text inside of the ingredient as well. If we save that and we go back, this now looks better, and I think it's way clearer that you can scroll this. And I'll now increase the height to 150. That looks like a good solution. So now these are my ingredients here. The next part which I want to output, of course, are the steps you need to follow to make this dish with these ingredients here. For that, I will repeat this title here. And since I will repeat it, we could move that into a separate widget, or at least move it into a builder method, and that's what I will do. I'll add a new method here to the meal detail screen widget, which I'll name build section title. The name is up to you. And I expect to get the text, you can name it title, text, whatever you want, as I input as an argument. And I return this container, which in the end outputs this text here, which will now be dynamic, and which also needs the context. So let's also accept build context here. And now we can call build section title down there and pass in the context and the title, which here was ingredients, and do the very same below our container there, and do the same for steps, because then I also want to output the steps. And now we avoided code duplication and have also a leaner widget tree down there, thanks to that avoided code duplication. Now another piece which I want to replicate is this container with the list view. The list view itself will then work differently. There I will use different list items for the steps, but the surrounding container should be the same. So we can also move that into a builder method, and again creating a separate widget, maybe one which you store in the same file if you only use it here, would also be fine. But I will add a builder method again, name this build container, and in there create my container with a certain child. That child is some input I expect to get, so that should be of type widget. And that's what I pass on to the container here. And then I can return it. And now the child is something we can pass in dynamically, so that we can now use the build container method down there to, well, build this container and pass child here as an argument. Not a named argument though, but just like this. And of course you could turn it into a named argument as well. And now we have build container. We can now also use build container down there, and now my child which I want to pass down there will also still be a list view, with the builder method, but with a different list item in there, so it's not a perfect copy. Just as before, builder method takes an item count, and now we're talking about the steps it takes to create that meal. So for the selected meal, I now will have the steps length that define the count for this list view builder, because I want to output all the steps here. And therefore the item builder, as before, receives the context and the index. And again, we can use the arrow function shortcut here. We return the widget we want to build for every list item. And here I'll use list tile, not card, but list tile. And in the list tile, I'll set leading to a circle avatar. And we saw that before, if you remember, in our personal expenses app. And circle avatar will have a child, and that should be text, which is the number of this step. And we can derive that number based on the index, because the index starts at 0 and then counts up all the way to the length of the steps -1, because it starts at 0. So here we can output maybe hash, and then string interpolation, use index +1 because it starts at 0, but we want to start at step 1, of course. To us humans, step 1 makes more sense than step 0, and output that here. So now we output the number of the step in a circle avatar at the beginning of our list tile. The title then is the step text. So here we have a text widget, which can be selected meal dot steps for the given index. And steps again is just a list of strings, so this already is the text I want to output. And with that, if we save this and reload, and we go to Italian, click on that, I'm getting an error, which has a cryptic error message, unfortunately, but which in the end is related to me not returning my container here in build container. Of course we have to return it here. We even stated here. Otherwise, build container here will, well, not render or not return a widget that can be rendered. So now this works, and now we have a different problem though. We go beyond the boundaries of our device. And you learned what we can do about that earlier. We can wrap our column, which we have here in the end, into a single child scroll view. So we can wrap this with a new widget, and that's the single child scroll view, which ensures that this column now is scrollable. And that's already it. Now we have that, and down there we have our steps, which are pretty nice to read and hopefully pretty clear. Now, as a tiny tweak, I also want to add a divider between these steps, and that can be achieved down there where we create these list tiles by not returning just a list tile, but actually a column, because I want to have two items on top of each other, where the list tile is the topmost item. But then, besides the list tile, or below the list tile, I use the divider widget, which is also built into Flutter. Whoops, should be here, however. And the divider widget will simply draw a horizontal line. So divider is provided by the Flutter framework, and it's added below the list tile. It's this tiny gray horizontal line you see here. So with that, I'd say this doesn't look too bad. It's a nice detailed page. Of course, you can tweak this to your likings, change the look if you want a different look. I think for this app, this is more than fine. But now with that, I of course also want to go back to more navigation features, because whilst we can go forth and back, which is nice, what we haven't really learned is how we can also use tabs or a side drawer, for example. And that's what we'll focus on next.